Welcome to a CUNY TV virtual town hall meeting, Police Defunding in a Time of Crisis. I'm Mike Gilliam. It is an idea that is gaining traction in a lot of cities across the nation, including right here in New York. Calls for defunding the police have been around for years, but in the wake of the killings of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis, Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta, and Breonna Taylor in Kentucky, and the coast-to-coast protests against racism and police brutality, the message is getting louder and it's beginning to resonate. Take Minneapolis, for example. There, the city council has agreed to dismantle the police department and create a new public safety system built on community input. Places like Denver and San Francisco are looking to redirect money from police department budgets to city services that help communities. In New York, there are proposals to cut the NYPD's $6 billion budget by $1 billion or more. But defunding police means different things to different people, and it's become a hot-button political issue. What exactly does the phrase mean? What would defunding the police look like? How would it work? Would it cut down on the violent contacts between police and Black and brown men that too often end in violence and death? And would our cities be safe for all? There's a lot to unravel. Here to help us, we have Lucy Lang, the director of the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. She's also a former assistant district attorney in Manhattan. Carla Shedd is an associate professor of urban education at the CUNY Graduate Center. She's a sociologist, and she's the author of Unequal City: Race, Schools, and Perceptions of Injustice. Brian Higgins spent 27 years in law enforcement and was chief of the Bergen County Police and director of public safety. He's an adjunct professor at John Jay. And Alex Vitale. Alex is a professor of sociology and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College. He spent 25 years writing about policing and is the author of the book, The End of Policing. Alex, let's start with you. Defunding the police. The phrase has been politicized now, with some saying people want to get rid of the police. What does it mean, and is it an idea whose time has come?
So defund the police is kind of a tagline that appeared, in the wake of these protests. It was something that could fit on a cardboard sign. It was something that could be put in a hashtag, but it's referring to a much broader movement that's been around, as you mentioned, for a number of years, that's calling for cities to rethink how they manage public safety. And it's calling for the shifting of resources from police and jails over to community identified initiatives that they think will make their communities safer than relying on armed police.
Brian, you come from a different perspective on this. Is that a non-starter, or is that something that we should be discussing?
So when we talk about defunding the police, there are those who believe it means just eliminating police agencies as we know it. That's almost a non-starter, because the vacuum it would create by not having a regulated force that can enforce our laws, you're going to have what you have in Georgia, where people just kind of take up arms and wish to enforce the laws. But as far as looking at how we fund police departments, and many of the non-traditional roles that we have tasked police officers with in the last few decades, I think it's worth looking at.
Lucy, jump in there.
I think it's an incredibly exciting time that there's so much energy around improving all the social systems that are supposed to be serving communities that we now know aren't doing that. And part of what defund the police means is calling on other agencies to fill in gaps that law enforcement has been having to fill over the past generation. And so I think it is really important that this not just be about removing money from one place, but where we're putting money, where the investment goes, and then who's informing how those decisions get made.
Mm-hmm. Carla, you deal with young people a lot in your work. How does this all kind of fit into where that stands and the problems that many of young people actually run into when dealing with police?
Well, I'm so excited for this moment. As a sociologist who studies public institutions, I study schools and I also study the justice system. And the nexus would be thinking about police as contact in both of those arenas. So young people are the ones who are basically the guinea pigs in this city-based experiment for where we put our resources, where we take them away. And it's not about police filling the gaps. These have been overt methods and moments where we have defunded education. We have defunded the supportive structures that would make it so that we would need less police. So it's an amazing moment to put the focus on what social services can we ramp up so we eliminate the need for surveillance and policing. And it's not necessarily about the fatal encounters. As someone who looks at young people, I'm thinking about the range of contacts and what I call the carceral continuum, where you are exposed to police even just walking your neighborhood, going to the store, going into schools, and there's a cumulative impact that is differently felt across race and place and class that we must interrogate, because none of this is random.
Yeah, I think that that's something that a lot of people don't realize, especially people who are not Black or brown. And that is that a guy like myself, when I see a police officer, I immediately think, oh, wait a minute, is there going to be some sort of interaction here? And in some of my other work, I've talked to white colleagues who have said, that doesn't even enter my mind. I don't even deal with the police. So there seems to be, and I believe there is, a definite different situation when it comes to Black and brown people and whites dealing with law enforcement.
And it's two-pronged. It's about the apparatus of the lights and the, the lynxes on the corner and how we come into encounters with police. We can think of Sandra Bland and what she might have felt when she's behind the wheel of her car and it becomes a fatal encounter that was prolonged from her being pulled over to then, ending up dead in a jail. So we really have a range of contacts to think about. And it's, as you said, not evenly distributed.
The NYPD budget is like $6 billion, basically. And they're talking about possibly cutting $1 billion from that. Is that workable, Brian?
So I think it is workable if you look at the different programs. One area I heard discussed was the school security program. So we're going to take $600 million from the NYPD budget, which includes the school security and safety program, and create its own entity. Just know when you create another entity, you're going to have a larger administrative pool on top, which means this is going to cost more money. The reason they were moved under the NYPD was to break down those barriers between the police agency and security so they worked better. If that's the goal, so that there's this less of a contact with police for kids who are in schools, I think it's worth looking at. But this defunding, I don't think anybody here would think that government takes money from one budget and moves it to the other, and then a cost savings is passed on to taxpayer. This is just going to balloon budgets.
How do you see that, Alex?
Well, not necessarily. I think that there are a lot of things that we could do more efficiently than relying on police who, once they get past the first few years and are receiving overtime, et cetera, they make extremely high salaries, well over six figures in many cases. And we could do things much more efficiently. For instance, the way we manage homeless people with police, cycling them through emergency rooms, shelters, and jails, chasing them off public transit. We have a lot of research that shows that's incredibly inefficient. And that if we actually just started putting people in supportive housing, that this would actually save money. And I think we should look similarly at things like how we deliver mental health services. Instead of using jails and police to manage that problem, we could use clinicians in community-based settings. And also, I'm totally opposed to this idea of just shifting who pays for school police from one agency to another. We need to reduce those number of uniformed law enforcement officers in our schools and put in counselors, social workers, rethink how we organize discipline in these schools to involve children in the process. So yes, there are going to be new expenses. This is not about saving money, but it's not about mushrooming the budget.
I really agree with Alex, Mike. I think that it's important to try to keep in mind part of the perspective of police here. And in my years working closely with the police as a prosecutor, I repeatedly heard officers say, I have to respond to things I'm not equipped to respond to. I'm being called to respond to a case of a mentally ill person, and I don't have the training to respond in the way that that person is best served. And so I think it's important to situate this in exactly what Carla described as the carceral continuum, that we end up with this kind of revolving door for people who suffer from substance use disorders, people who suffer from mental health challenges, and it does end up ballooning into to include the budgets for jails and prisons.
But if you lose the number of police officers, you get more people out of the prisons, how do you maintain, and I'm playing the devil's advocate here, how do you maintain safety on our streets?
Well, you know, this is more than anything, this defund the movement, it's a public safety movement. And it's led by people who have experienced a profound lack of safety in their lives. These movements are led typically by women of color who have experienced violence and for whom the police were not a source of safety. They were actually a source of more difficulty and sometimes more violence in their lives. And what they've identified are concrete, targeted strategies that they think will make communities safer. Violence interruption programs, domestic violence initiatives located in communities, working with young people to try to break that cycle of violence. So this is about rethinking this idea that only armed police can act as a kind of deterrent after the fact for violence and other kinds of crime, and really trying to think, what are these community interventions that could prevent crime from happening in the first place?
And there's so many levels to this discussion where we can, make this huge disconnect between police equaling safety, and it does not. And young people in particular make that clear as they, in my survey responses from research in Chicago and Chicago public school students who say, calling the police is not an option. They do not make me feel safe. But here I am seeing them armed in my high school. I have to confront them the first thing in my day, and this sets the tone for what's happening to me and what should be a space of education. And so if we think about the budgets, it will show us what our priorities are, and it's showing us where we have defunded the counselors, we have defunded the educational supports. And I'm always upset to think about when people say, oh, well, we'll give prison education a try. And why don't we do that before young people have to go to prison and connect with the system?
So what would public safety look like? Now, if you have an emotionally disturbed person, an officer is sent to that call, if you call 911. Under some of these defunding models, what would public safety look like in a situation like that?
Mike, I think we've seen it already. We've had bail reform. We've had other police reforms before the George Floyd death, and we see crime rates going through the roof. So we have to think of the other side of this. The programs we've started to try are not working. Bail reform needs to be looked at very, very closely. We're talking about armed officers in schools, and believe me, I understand it. I have an 11-year-old. I don't want to see him dealing with the police in school. But on the day there's a school shooting incident, I hope to God that there are enough cops with guns to get there as quickly as possible.
Well, rather than respond to some of that, what I feel is grossly inaccurate information, I just want to say that we have a concrete plan for addressing the mental health issue, which is that Jumaane Williams, the elected public advocate, has laid out an evidence-based strategy for completely removing police from the mental health business. It involves setting up community-based mental health services and creating a 24-hour crisis response capacity that is not staffed by armed police. This is the way it is done in much of Europe. This is the way it's done in some other parts of the United States. And between 1.5% of all people killed by police in the United States are having a mental health crisis. And we have evidence to show that there are better alternatives than relying on them. And using scare tactics about little blips in crime here and there in the midst of a 30-year reduction in crime is trying to derail us from having the conversation we really need to have.
part of that comes from the unions that represent officers. Do you believe that the police unions have too much power at this point, Alex?
Absolutely. I think that they have been a major impediment, not just in terms of shielding officers from accountability, but in promoting this worldview that says that the only way certain communities can be kept safe is through constant threats, harassment, and violence. And I think, frankly, that is a racist worldview, and that any politician who embraces that worldview is working against any kind of progressive agenda for racial and economic justice in our city. And that's why we've seen in the last few weeks 15 or 20 elected officials in New York reject the past endorsements of the police unions.
Mm-hmm. Brian, what do you think about that?
There are some concerns I have with police unions and their association with elected officials. In effect, the police union becomes a lobbyist organization, and they do get too comfortable. As Alex said about the salaries, and I do believe that police officers, for what they deal with, should be paid well, but police unions have some influence in elected officials through their campaign.
I'm curious to know, Brian, do you think that there should be a statewide licensing program for police officers, which would put them in a position where they had to be licensed, they had a certain amount of training, but they run the risk of losing that licensing if they're involved in misconduct?
Yeah, and putting on my administrator hat, there have been times when there are police officers that we've attempted to discipline or fire, and we were kept from doing that. Or there was quite frankly, a deal made very quietly where the officer resigned. There would be no lawsuits, and that officer is allowed to seek employment somewhere else. So I believe that every state should have, there's a program called POST that many states adopt. I think that's fair. If each state had a POST certification and then it was reciprocal throughout the country, we could weed out more of these officers that should not be on the job.
This is a structural issue. It's not about individual officers. It's about a culture and a structure that is set up for surveillance and control and not for safety necessarily. And so when you think of these examples of police being called in to help a mentally disturbed person, I saw one video where a social worker was there in between the line of fire, and he was shot by police as a social worker trying to shield his client. So we obviously know this is not effective. And so when we have this moment now where the abolitionist imagination has been sparked nationwide, I'm really excited. And it's not necessarily saying we get rid of everything. And I know people won't be ready for that, but we have to put in place some ideas of what we can do where it would make it possible that police and prisons would be obsolete.
I also think we'd be remiss if we didn't identify the recently released draft report from the medical examiner's office that indicates that, in fact, the numbers that we have understood about people who have died during police interactions over the past years seem to have been significantly underreported. And we will learn more in the coming weeks and months about the reason for that underreporting, but that should be a cause for alarm for everyone.
Yeah, and those numbers that you're talking about there are very surprising. I mean, like, they're saying that the police killings in New York City are higher than reported, 54% of them being Black, 26% Latino, and only 16% white, and that there were like twice as many of these killings than we really knew about. And they're saying that it wasn't really because police were doing something not to report them, but it's the way, in fact, that they culled that information. But those numbers are startling.
8% of all homicides committed in the United States are committed by police. So this is a public health problem. In fact, the American Public Health Association, in its annual meeting a couple of years, called for exactly these kinds of defund the police strategies as a way of improving American public health. Our over-reliance on what are essentially violence workers to solve every problem under the sun is adding violence to our society.
So why the pushback, do you think? Is it because of jobs, that people would lose jobs or income?
Well, we would create new jobs. You know, I talk to police all the time, and I talk to young people thinking about going into policing. And one of the things I hear is that policing is attractive because of the excellent benefits, the high pay, the chance to make a lot of overtime, and because there are no other jobs that young people can take to directly assist people in their community. And I've often asked them, if there were a job available working in a community center, coaching basketball and mentoring young people with real challenges in their lives, with the same pay and benefits as policing, which job would you choose? And invariably, they all laugh and they say, well, of course, we would much rather work in a community center, but there are no such jobs. And that's the problem.
Look, the goal, I think, is ultimately to have a world where we didn't have police, we wouldn't need courts, and we wouldn't need any of these things that are use of force, for lack of a better term. The number of shootings in places like Newark and Patterson are still through the roof. And they all, if you look at the history, it goes back to the years that they reduced the policing. So yes, I think we all in law enforcement want to see that day where we don't need as many cops, we don't need to use guns. But I don't see any example of situations we've tried that work where crime doesn't go through the roof. And there are, I know we want to talk about mental health and we want to talk about people who are of need, but the fact is there are just some really bad, violent people in the world, and I can't think of another way to address that violence.
I've heard people say, though, that, you know, one way to look at this and what law enforcement should look like in all communities is it should look like law enforcement in suburban communities, where every contact with police doesn't end with a situation where you have a person worried about violence and brutality and that sort of thing. Because quite frankly, it looks a lot different in the burbs than it looks in our communities.
But not if you're Black in the burbs. So let's be clear about what we're talking about in terms of the place and then the people who are in those places. So if there is homogeneity and the homogeneity is whiteness, you do see a different framework for how we understand the control of who comes into those spaces.
We're just about out of time. I'd like to get from each of you what you think policing should look like as we move forward.
Police are violence workers. That's what distinguishes them from all other forms of government service. And so we need to think long and hard about what are exactly those things that we can only, you know, rely on violence workers to deal with. And it's not a straightforward question of little things versus small things. We have excellent research in New York City about the role of community-based violence interrupters in dramatically reducing homicides and shootings. So we need to empower communities to start putting in place real alternatives, and then we'll see what's left at the end of that process.
That's a bad way of putting it. The police are a violent group. When you look at the amount of police officers and the amount of interaction with the public every day, the violence is less than a percentage of a percentage. It's a very small amount. What I think of police officers are those who are the first at your home when you have a medical condition. They're the ones that are coming when you dial 911 and you're being attacked violently. They're the ones that are patrolling in neighborhoods when people are being raped. So there is violence involved in this. To put it all on the cops, that the cops are the ones that enter violence into the situation, I think is really a kind of a way of starting a discussion that's really meant to only focus on the negative part of policing.
Wow. You know, police sometimes can be the rapist too, and then who do you call? I really want to disrupt these causal connections for sure. And Alex clearly said they're violence workers in contrast to social workers. And so if police are brokers, as I call it, on a carceral continuum, they direct people toward a punitive system. Instead of doing that, I would love to shore up the people who are brokers on an educational continuum. So the teachers, the social workers, to think about, even with COVID closing all of our schools, we still needed essential supports for food. We still thought about, oh, we need someone to watch children of essential workers. So I would love to shore up those supports and get rid of the funding that goes to police, because we might not need them.
And Lucy, I'll give you the last word.
I don't know that I deserve the last word amongst all of these really thoughtful folks, but J. Scott Thompson, in his op-ed in the Washington Post recently about the work that he did rebuilding the Camden Police Department, talked about the importance of making a cultural shift from police thinking of themselves as warriors to thinking of themselves as guardians. And so I would double down on what Carla said about investing in education and all of the upfront services. And then to the extent that we do still need police, I would encourage all police to frame their role as public servant as that of a guardian.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it at that right there. But this is a topic that is sure to be in the news in the days and weeks ahead as cities grapple with the issues of racism and police brutality and how to best spend taxpayer dollars. I want to thank our guest, Lucy Lang, the director for the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, Carla Shedd, an associate professor of urban education at the CUNY Graduate Center, Brian Higgins, the former chief of the Bergen County Police Department and director of public safety, and an adjunct professor at John Jay, and Alex Vitale, a professor of sociology and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College. Thank you all for taking part in just a great conversation. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our virtual town hall meeting, Police Defunding in a Time of Crisis.